Good evening, Life Group. So good to be with you. As we're going to just jump into the next 4 weeks of talking through the book of Philippians. And we've specifically chosen this book to talk to you about because I think it really plays so well into what we've just been talking about, the whole idea of evangelism. And I think this speaks so much more to the spiritual side or the emotional side of why we need to evangelize, or, what do we need as an attitude or having to have as a state of being for us to be able to minister. So maybe you've jumped into tonight and you didn't even know we're talking about Philippians tonight. So you haven't had an opportunity to maybe just go through the book of Philippians, which I think is great for where we want to jump into tonight. So I want to jump right in with a question and ask you, just for a few minutes, just jump in and let's just talk around in our group about how many facts you know about the book of Philippians. So let's pause here and just see how many facts we can come up with. I think it will be a great exercise. All right, guys, so let me jump also in and just throw a bunch of facts at you. This might, for some of you, feel a little bit mundane, but I think it's just going to help us as we just think through this book of Philippians and specifically where we're going to head. So I also want to say that with this, on this YouTube video, there is a link to a PDF file, which is the Philippians Layout. And this is the structure that we're going to be talking to. So you're so welcome to download this PDF. There's some space for notes at the end. And I think it will really help you as we just talk through this each week, focusing on specific things, just so that you can know exactly why we're saying what we're saying and where this is coming from. So obviously, we have to start when we think about the book of Philippians. Who's the author of this book? We know that Paul is the author of this book. Paul, who wrote 14 of the 27 books in the New Testament. He's called the Apostle of Apostles. We also know that when Paul wrote this specific letter, it was one of only 4 letters that he actually wrote from prison. The other ones kind of being Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. But here, this story is this Paul. Who is Paul? I don't know if you've even noticed this, but Paul, they say, is Paul, that is this man from Tarsus. Tarsus is this little town in northern Turkey. And it's kind of been like that for a few thousand years. So if you want to get a picture of what Paul really looked like, you have to go look at some of what the Turkish people look like. Probably going to be close to having a descriptor for what Paul looked like. We also know that Paul studied under Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the head of the Sanhedrin. Gamaliel was this head priest in Jerusalem. We also read of him in the book of Acts. You remember his story when he's the one that stood up and said, if this is from God, nobody can stop it. If this is not from God, it's going to fizzle out. Obviously, we know that story. And this was the person that Paul studied under. Now, to study under Gamaliel, that means that Paul probably started studying under him from a very young age, probably around the age of 12, 13, just when he had his bar mitzvah, when he turned into a man. They would move him to Jerusalem to study under Gamaliel. And it's very interesting because it's only here in this book of Philippians that Paul actually gives us his CV. Philippians is Paul's CV. He gives us his story where he talks about how he was circumcised on the 8th day. He's from Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Hebrew of Hebrews. Speaks about the law. He's a Pharisee. Speaks about his zeal persecuting the church. Legalistic righteousness. He says, I'm faultless. He just kind of gives this kind of CV. And obviously we know that this is the Paul that was beheaded by Nero in AD 67. So it kind of gives you this idea. This is this Paul that writes this letter from prison, right? And it's very important to know why he wrote this letter from prison. That's kind of why I'm throwing this at you. But also he was writing this to this church, the Philippians. The people were called the Philippians because it was in the city called Philippi. Now, this city for hundreds of years used to be called Cronidus. And this city was one of the wealthiest cities because it had a major gold deposit. Now, this city is found in northern Greece today. And before Cronidus changed its name, or how it came that it changed its name, is the fact that there was this guy from Macedonia, which was part of this region in Greece. This king, Philip of Macedon, came and conquered Crenides. Why? Because he wanted the gold. And he changed the name of the city to himself. He named it after himself, Philip. Now, the story of the city of Philippians is not what really makes Philip so popular or well known. It was more because of who his son was. Now, if you did not know, his son was called Alexander the Great. And we know Alexander the Great stories and how he conquered so many of the occupied world of that time. And as Philippi was the most affluential city here in this region in Macedonia, it used to be called the gateway between Europe and Asia. As a matter of fact, Philippi was the furthest city of the Roman Empire, of what was the Roman Empire at that time. And it came that gold made King Philip a very powerful ruler, made him a very powerful man. Even the Caesars were a little bit afraid of him. And that's why they didn't even try and do anything with Philip or Alexander in his time. It was only later when Octavian, when he became Caesar, we kind of know octa means 8, right? Octavian. He changed his name and he became Augustus Caesar. If you think about the 8th month, octa, 8th month of our year is August. See, it's named after Augustus Caesar. And so Augustus Caesar took over this region and he was after the gold because the gold made him very, very rich. And because this city was also a very strong agricultural and a very strong military center, instead of a commercial one, very few Jewish people actually went into this town. And I think that's one of the things that drew Paul to the city, because remember, Paul had a discussion with Peter and he says, Peter, you go and minister to the Jewish people. I'm going to go and preach to the Gentiles. I'm going to go and speak to those that are not Jewish. And even the people who were living in Philippi were all pretty much very wealthy people because they were exempt from paying tax because of the gold that was there. It's literally recorded that this city became the first city or the first region here in Macedonia. It was the first city in the history of the world that could actually be classified as being colonized. And so this colonialism brought in so many different kinds of people into it because of religion, of their priests and their temples that they tried to build there. And these Philippians worshipped all these kind of foreign gods. And there's also this place where they built one of the biggest stadiums. It's still there today to come and kind of see this stadium that was a precursor to the Olympic Games. This was kind of probably where they had some of the prelims to the Olympic Games in that story. And because it was such a strong agricultural heavy city, and you can see that, and because of its military might, you can kind of see the language that Paul uses plays a lot into that. I'll touch on that now. But then about this church. See, Philippi was literally the first city where the gospel was preached in Europe. Philippians, this church that was started in a jail. If you remember the story in Acts chapter 16. Because remember, the city of Philippi is in Macedonia. We today in the Bible, we refer to this as the Macedonian call. This is a vision that Paul had. You'll remember this from Acts 16. And it says, a man from Macedonia came and said to Paul, come over to us. And Paul describes in his story then how this call became a reality. And he wanted to go to Macedonia because of this call of God on his heart. We see that as when Paul started his second missionary journey there in Acts chapter 16. Also, this is the first place, the very first convert in Europe happens to be a woman. I think that was a very interesting fact for me. And her name was Lydia. And we read about Lydia in a few of Paul's letters where he sends greetings from Lydia, or he says something that Lydia did. And for me, I think there should be another discussion about God's call for women. He always calls women first. Like the first person ever to preach the good news of Jesus being raised from the dead was Mary. Because Mary was the first one at the tomb, and Jesus came to her and says, Mary, go tell my brothers, go tell my friends. And there was something so special for me about that. And here's the thing, this was also where Paul and Silas was actually in prison, right here in Philippi. Remember that story where they just started worshiping and it's like an earthquake and then the doors of the jail opened and they just walked out? This is also the place where the jailer got saved in Paul's story. And we also know that this church sent Paul financial help. And Paul mentions this. He says this in Philippians chapter 2. He says this in Philippians chapter 4. He speaks about a man called Epaphroditus. See, Epaphroditus was probably a very wealthy businessman, and he was the person that took a bunch of gifts from this church in Philippi. Now you can imagine these people in this city is fairly wealthy, and so they probably gave good gifts. They gave a lot of money to Paul, and he was the carrier of this to Paul. And you see Paul kind of thanking him. So in one sense, Philippians is very much a thank you letter to as a missionary to this. And he's just saying thank you for all that they have given him. And later we kind of pick this up here in this book of Philippians as Epaphroditus was sent to him. But see, Philippians is what is considered in Scripture the happiest book of the Bible. It's just a happy book. Here, if you want to summarize Philippians, maybe I've given this away because this is on top of those notes that we've downloaded, that you can sum up the entire book of Philippians in one word: joy. See, joy is mentioned 19 times in this book. See, the key to Paul's joy was also his source. And he mentions this 3 times. What was the source of his joy? He says, the source of my joy is the Lord. He says, I find my joy in the Lord, in the Lord. And I'm going to jump into this now because I said to you, like, there's different analogies that Paul always uses through every one of the 14 of the 27 books he writes. He always just uses 4 different types of analogies. He either uses a military analogy, he uses an architectural analogy, in like the temple. He uses an agricultural analogy, like sowing, reaping. And then he uses athletics a lot. He uses that a lot in Corinthians, for example, as well. But here in this book, he focuses specifically on using 2 different kinds of analogies. He speaks about political and he speaks about athletic references. And we're going to pick that up as we look through this. But there was a secret that what Paul was trying to convey about what was the secret to his joy. Yes, it was in the Lord. He says, but how did I get that? How do I keep myself in the Lord? And he calls this, the secret to my joy is my mind. My mind. Now, when he uses the word mind, he's not talking about a cognitive thinking. He's using this to say, this is a preset thought. It becomes an attitude. This is an attitude that I have all the time. You see, when he uses this word mind, mind is mentioned 10 times in this book, in Philippians. And it also uses the word think 5 times. And you add all those 16 references where he mentions the word remember as well. You see, he's saying there's so much about a attitude that I have towards things, and that becomes the secret to how I keep my joy. Because he was saying my outlook is going to determine my outcome. And Philippians is just literally a Christian psychology book based on really solid doctrine. So I want us to look at that outline because today I want us to focus just on Philippians chapter 1. Here in Philippians chapter 1, Paul speaks about having a single mind. Chapter 2, he speaks about having a submissive mind. Chapter 3, a spiritual mind. And in chapter 4, having a secure mind. We're going to talk about each one of those. But today I want us to focus literally about Paul's, how did he have a single mind? And in that, he spoke about 3 things. He highlights 3 things that for him, keeps him in that single-mindedness. He speaks about the fellowship of the gospel. That's going to be the first 11 verses. And then in verse 12 to 26, he speaks about the furtherance of the gospel, the advancement of the gospel. That's what we've now been talking about in evangelism. How do we just walk across the room? How do we advance the gospel? And then lastly, he speaks about having the faith of the gospel. And so I want us to really just look a little bit about this single-mindedness. See, in this first part where he speaks about the fellowship of the gospel, In those first 11 verses, there's one verse that just keeps on jumping out. It's like the sore thumb in this section. And in this section, he speaks about this. He says this in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 5. He says, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. See, in this letter, Paul opens with thanksgiving and rejoicing over the Philippians and their shared commitment to the gospel. But there's the thing. He's in prison. He's in prison. But his focus isn't on them. Or let me say, his focus is on them, not on himself. See, that's kind of his single mind. His single mind is about the joy in partnering with other people to advance the gospel. He was always thinking about the gospel. In Romans 1 verse 16, he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. What is gospel? Gospel means good news. Paul couldn't stop telling people about the good news. I mean, we've all seen these kind of Second World War movies where there's two soldiers kind of in a trench. See, this is kind of the picture that Paul is trying to create here. He's saying, we're together in this trench. And it doesn't matter what is around us. What are the circumstances around us? It's not about those circumstances. It's about moving and advancing this mission. Because see, Paul is very clever. Because in each one of these chapters, he also addresses what he calls a joy robber. There is a thing that can steal your joy. And here, in this very first chapter, he says one of the things that steals our joy so often is our circumstances. We keep our eyes on other things, and it takes our eyes off Jesus. It takes our eyes off the mission. It takes our eyes off the gospel. It takes our eyes off the good news. It takes our eyes off, and when we start doing that, we start drifting. I hear this so often. People are saying, I've moved away from my life group, for example. I'm not in community anymore. I used to do this often at church. People say, hey, pastor, can I come and speak to you? And, whatever the situation is about their job or their marriage or something like that. My first answer is absolutely. I would love to meet with you. Would you mind bringing your life group leader and we can talk? And they go, life group? I don't have a life group leader. I said, well, see, that's your problem. See, God didn't make us to be isolated. He made us to be in fellowship with one another. See, joy grows when we remember we are not alone. Joy grows when we know we are in partnership with other people that are like-minded, that have that same attitude, which is Philippians chapter 2, we'll talk about. But it speaks about how we now further this gospel. Can we pause here for a second? And I just want us to talk for a second about what has community meant for you? What has fellowship meant for you in terms of furthering the gospel? How has this life group helped encourage you, strengthened you, so that you can be more resilient, more bold in your witness? And talk about how can we encourage one another more towards that. Let's take a few minutes to do that. In the next part, here in verse 12 to 26 of Philippians chapter 1, Paul speaks about how do we further the gospel. He says, I have a single mind. I have only one thing on my mind. This is the thing that's going to drive me, and it's going to be that we advance the gospel. We're going to tell people about Jesus. Again, there's a key verse that kind of stands out. Here in Philippians 1 verse 12, it says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me actually served to advance the gospel. See, Paul says, I'm in chains. I'm in physical chains, but the gospel isn't in chains. He says, I'm not going to have circumstances dictate the gospel. I might be in chains, but the gospel isn't. He says, even while I'm here, the guards are hearing about Jesus. We read this in other parts, in other of his epistles. We read this from some of the Jewish historians of the day. They tell us that while Paul was shackled in prison, what they used to do is they used to shackle a Roman soldier to him so that he can't escape or go anywhere. And history tells us that they had to change that guard every single day because all that Paul did was start leading them to Jesus. He was just keep on telling them about Jesus. He couldn't help that. He just wanted believers to be so emboldened. Circumstances doesn't hinder God's plan. Even Joseph in Egypt. I mean, he was thrown in a pit. He went through jail. He was in Potiphar's house. I mean, he had to work his way up. And it was just a tough life for Joseph. And at the end of Joseph's life, listen to what he says. Joseph says this. He says, speaking to his brothers that did all of this to him, he says, you meant all of this for evil, but God meant it for good. He's saying, how does God use our circumstances to kind of push us and to further the gospel? It's the same idea here in Philippians. He says, joy comes when we see God's purpose and not just our own pain. When we start looking beyond our pain, we start seeing a purpose. I remember Jane Seymour, the actress, she came to South Africa, and I happened to be at the same conference where she was, and there was a bunch of cameras on her. Media was interviewing her, and she was working with a lot of HIV/AIDS people and so on. And they said to Jane, why is it that you do this? She says, it's very simple. My mom used to tell me, she says, my mom said, when you're feeling down, when you feel like life's not working out, when life is painful, go and help somebody else. Just go and help somebody else. And in that helping somebody else, it just picks you up. I found that the same. Whenever I get to lead somebody to Jesus, I am so glad that they have found Jesus. But I think I walk away more filled. I walk away more fulfilled. I walk away knowing, wow, I got to play a part in somebody's story. I got to play a part in somebody now that is going to take the gospel a little bit further. Now I want you to get to this place where when you ask this question, like when things go wrong, ask, how is God using this to advance the gospel in me or through me? Is this idea of choosing perspective over pity? Maybe for a few minutes, let's talk in our groups about how are some circumstances actually moved you to tell people more about Jesus? What circumstances changed in your life that emboldened your witness so much? How has God used certain circumstances to actually further the gospel? Let's talk about this for a while. Here in our last part, Paul is saying, listen, this single-minded focus, this attitude I have is because I have faith. I have this faith. Faith in the gospel. I have the faith of the gospel. I have faith in this good news. Here it's about those last kind of 3-4 verses in Philippians chapter 1. And he says this in verse 27. He says, whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. These are familiar words. Paul kind of echoes the very same sentiment in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 1, where Paul writes to the Ephesian church, also from prison, and he says to them, I want you to walk worthy of the calling of Jesus Christ. Walk worthy of the calling of Jesus Christ. Here in Philippians, he says, conduct yourselves. It's the same word as walk. It's the same word as walk in that manner worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. See, now this word worthy is such a nice word that Paul uses. It's a nice illustration from Paul all the time. See, Paul uses this word worthy, and he says it's worth something. It's got a value to it. You got to put a value to it. Because see, this word in the Greek that is used here is this word called axios. Axios means axle. And this was a word that they were borrowed from the marketplace. You remember in the marketplace, they used to have those old school scales where you put a weight on the one side and then you put your product on the other side. And because that product has a certain value attached to it, and so that value, that weight keeps put until it's equal to. That is what Paul is saying. He says, Christ has given you a calling. Christ is asking you to preach the gospel. The gospel has a weight. He says, are you on the same weight as the gospel? That's where we have to have our faith. We have to have faith that Christ is putting a value in us. He's putting a worth to us. He's putting a weight in us. And the call for us is to kind of live out this gospel in unity and in courage Even when we're suffering, even when our circumstances doesn't look like that. Because joy comes not from easy living, joy comes from faithful living. It's sometimes true, we all go through some tough times, but I get a choice. I get to choose. Do I choose today to focus on this tough times, or do I choose to walk worthy of the gospel? Do I choose to not let my circumstances dictate how I feel about God? I have the joy of the Lord, independent of my circumstances. Yeah, somebody broke into my car. Yeah, one of my tires were stolen. Yeah, my car radio was stolen. That, to crown it all off, somebody drove into me. Then I'd kick the cat on the way out. I hear the stories. It's not about your circumstance. It's about how do you think, how do you get a single mind to say, I'm focused on Jesus. I don't mind I don't care what's happening. I'm just going to keep on looking up and following Jesus. And it's almost like about a team. Think of any team, a hockey team, a rugby team, any kind of team sports. We talk about home games and away games. Sometimes you're going to go play that away game at somebody else's stadium. And usually you get a very hostile reception. They're not happy that you're there. They want to make sure their team wins. And sometimes it feels like you walking into a hostile stadium. And Paul says, even if you're walking into those circumstances, he says, stand firm, strive together, don't be intimidated. That's the mindset of joy. See, if we're really going to further this gospel, we got to get the joy of the Lord in us. People want to see how happy we are in Christ. So let's live in a way that honors Christ, standing firm, striving together, and not backing down, because I think our faithfulness will bring joy even when life is hard. In these last moments, I want us to pray for one another, but before that, I just want us to have a little discussion about what does faith in the good news look like for you? And then the second question is, how can you get the same single mind that Paul had, that became the source of his joy? Let's talk about this, and we'll continue with this next week. God bless you.